Hello, people online. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Whadjuk Noongar land and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. But it's my pleasure today to introduce Amy Shields Dobson, who is, amongst other things, the CCAP program leader for the Digital Intimacies stream program, with the absolutely wonderfully titled presentation, Miranda and Nakkiah Decolonise Morning Television, Anger, Refusal and Imagining Beyond Intersectional Inclusivity in the Time of Me Too. Magic.
Thanks, Tama. Hello, Kaya. Thanks so much for coming today. As Tama said, my name's Amy, and I'd also like to start by acknowledging these are the unceded lands that we're on of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of these lands from the past, present and future, as well as those of the Walyulup area where I live and spend a lot of my time working as well. Okay, so I'll get straight into it because I've got a lot of stuff to get through. I'd like to start with a couple of quotes that sort of I've been trying to use to guide my thinking and writing recently. The first one is by Audre Lorde, which I've got up here on the slides, but I'll read. It's not the anger of other women that will destroy us, but our refusals to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it, to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance, to tap that anger as an important source of empowerment. And then a quote from the show that I'm going to discuss later in this talk, Miranda Tapsell on the finale of Get Krack. 30 years of smiling and making big eyes and not showing my anger. I'm done not being angry. I am angry. And if you don't like me being angry, then by all means, Australia, take my furious baton and run this race for me, because we're dying in infancy, we're dying in custody, and we're dying decades earlier than you, and you should be as angry about that as I am. Come on, babe, let's go to Sunrise and fuck this shit up. So we're in, and then two other quotes from theorists that I've been trying to engage with, and that I'll get to in a moment. Maria Lugones writes, I moved to read the social from the cosmologies that inform it. The move I'm recommending is a very different from one that reads gender into the social. And Karma Chavez, who writes, projects of inclusion don't rupture oppressive structures. Instead, they uphold and reinforce those structures by showing how they can be kinder and gentler and better without actually changing much at all. So those are the starting points for this talk. So we're in a digitally networked world that has seen significant attention to and consciousness raising around issues of both gendered and racialised violence via, very prominently and visibly, the Me Too and the Black Lives Matter hashtags. And concurrently, while awareness and attention to intersectionality as a framework for understanding diverse standpoints, positionalities and inequalities across multiple axes of oppression has increased, I think the kind of discursively separate nature of these two movements is somewhat telling, or I've been trying to think about that. And in short, I think, you know, we're currently in a digitally mediated cultural landscape where some feminist issues have recently gained increased traction and attention in very complicated and ambivalent ways, where feminist discourses have found their way into popular and celebrity spheres of culture, compared with a recent past where feminist media scholars, including myself, were lamenting a more active repudiation of feminism in what we theorised as post-feminist media cultures. So the Me Too movement, and there's so much that's been written on it, I'm not going to go into all of it today, like just a very small amount, has been key in drawing attention and visibility to gendered harassment and violence as systemic and global issues, but in ways that are quite bound into, of course, as many theorists have written about, and echo the logics of digital media and celebrity cultures. And in short, a white, westernised, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied female subject position is still presumed by and in much of the discourse about gender violence that has emerged in the wake of Me Too. Writing in the Turtle Island North American context, Ashley Mack and Chamorro scholar Tiara Naputi point out about Me Too that knowledge-making, resistance, activism, pedagogy and healing about what is dominantly called gender violence is and has been happening in the realm of beyond the realm of media visibility, as they witness in their research in First Nations digital media practices and communities. Mack and Naputi suggest a decolonial feminist orientation understands gendered violence, such as sexual assault, as part of colonial violence and attends to the combined processes of racialisation, gender dichotomisation and heterosexualism in modernity. I think I'm going to have to put this on. Importantly, can you still hear me? They add, examining gendered violence from this orientation also requires resisting the reproduction of colonial logics by engaging with dissident ways of knowing and being. Like Mack and Naputi, I'm interested more broadly in what Argentinian feminist philosopher and activist Maria Lugones describes as, quote, social organisations from which people have resisted modern capitalist modernity that are in tension with its logics. In short, First Nations feminist scholars from both here in Australia and from Turtle Island, and I'm referring to those because I've been most sort of influenced by reading Eileen Morton-Robinson, Vanessa Watts, Eve Tuck, Audra Simpson and Leanne Bedasamasake Simpson. And these scholars for a while now have been articulating and advocating for a position of refusal of the logics of capitalist modernity, which also determine the logics of gender violence as a kind of a frame, how we conceive it, discuss it and respond to it. I'm interested in where we can see, in and through media and culture, the refusal of heteropatriarchal capitalist modernity and its logics, rather than a kind of intersectional inclusivity of all other people and subject positions within it. And I guess in this talk and in thinking about this finale of Get Krack, I've been wondering about the ways that perhaps this kind of position that's been put forth by decolonial feminists of refusal over inclusivity may be more legible, more possible to kind of hear and understand in this moment, particularly since the rise of these very visible hashtag movements. And at least, and that's, you know, that's the case for me, speaking from my position as a queer, white, non-binary identifying feminist who's been educated in gender studies by other white feminists in, you know, what are still very Euro-centric scholarly traditions and institutions. I would like to think, and I'm hoping that it's becoming more possible for me to start to understand things and perspectives now that I didn't, you know, even a couple of years ago. So I'm going to discuss a media intervention made by Miranda, Tapsell and Nakkiah Lui in 2019 on the satirical feminist comedy show Get Krack, which I'm just wondering about the ways that that episode came into being and kind of is possible in a way that and legible in a way that it might not have been in a recent past. So before I get so intersectional feminist critiques of the Me Too movement, I want to kind of talk through in brief. And like I said, a lot has been written about the Me Too movement and its impacts on public discourses about sexism, gender and violence, and how it's helped broaden the acknowledgement of everyday forms of sexism, discrimination, microaggressions and experience of violence along gendered lines as kind of normal, usual, expected and accepted within society. And a lot has also been written about the limitations of Me Too as a movement, who it addresses, whose issues are addressed by it, and who is able to be included within its dominant terms and discourses. So in brief, this movement went viral because of the take-up of this hashtag by US-based celebrity actresses, and scholars and activists have noted that it still most visibly amplifies the concerns of these more structurally privileged women, which is particularly ironic given the origins of the phrase Me Too. So US-based, Turtle Island-based activist Tarana Burke has been credited as the founder of the movement, as she developed workshops and community networks using this phrase as a way to draw attention to issues of systemic inequality for black and brown women and girls impacted by violence. So Burke wrote in 2017 of the impact of this movement and the ongoing work needed in amplifying more structurally marginalised voices as follows. One of the most powerful things about Me Too has been its ability to allow people to expand the conversation beyond celebrity. The reality of seeing everyday people, friends, neighbours, co-workers, family, disclosing that their various experiences with sexual violence has been jarring for many and enlightening for most. I started this work with the intention of reaching young black and brown girls, but fully believing in its potential to move the world. Some people call it a watershed moment, and there definitely feels like a shift is happening, but it feels incomplete. What history has shown us time and again is that if marginalised voices, those of people of colour, queer people, disabled people, poor people, aren't centred in our movements, they tend to become no more than a footnote. Ending sexual violence, Burke writes, will require every voice from every corner of the world, and it will require those voices who are most often heard to find ways to amplify voices that go unheard. And writing about the Me Too movement with a focus on critical trans and queer of colour approaches to studying the discourses around it, Vijo Su argues that critical intersectional feminist accounts help highlight then the shortcomings, not just of Me Too, but of many major feminist and other social movements. Su suggests Me Too offers a generative study for how exclusionary rhetorics emerge regardless of inclusive intentions. As Sue notes, what has resulted in Me Too is not a democratic commingling of stories, but a vocal configuration that replicates extant social hierarchies, perhaps unsurprisingly. Intersectional feminist critiques have long been directed at precisely this issue and have argued repeatedly that, as Sue summarises, narrow forms of recognition available to a privileged few do not transform oppressive regimes. Rather, they disguise and justify the conditions of oppression. Sort of, I think, along similar lines of the quote from Karma Chavez there. In brief, Sue summarises intersectional feminist critiques put forth by scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill-Collins argued that accounts of oppression and violence need to be multi-axes in focus and should begin rather than end with the accounts of those most structurally and socially vulnerable and precarious. So scholars concerned with more kind of multi-axes, networked, coalitional, or as Patricia Hill-Collins writes about, transversal approaches to violence have noted that the most prominent debates about steps for change in relation to gender violence since Me Too have focused around criminalisation and carceral responses. And as Sue notes, this limited vision of justice has left many, specifically those most vulnerable to gender violence, beyond the purview of Me Too. Sue argues that a key point often left out of debates about carceral responses sparked by Me Too is that sexual violence is an integral component to the prison system. And the most vulnerable to sexual violence are also frequently targeted by policing and criminalisation. And so, and hence in Australia, Indigenous and First Nations legal scholars and activists have particularly highlighted the racialised and colonial dimensions of carceral responses to violence that produce further violence towards Indigenous people, as you know, Hannah McGlade's work here helps us understand. And this has, of course, become very notable right now in Australia in the debates about the criminalisation of coercive control. And there was a great recent article in The Conversation by Chelsea Wadigo, who's a Mununjali and South Sea Islander scholar, Alison McCoon, David Singh and Elizabeth I can't read my own notes there, around where they're writing about carceral feminism and the recent SBS series, Look What You Made Me Do, and offer an analysis that highlights the issues with the uprising of carceral feminist responses and violence towards Indigenous women who are not seen as ideal victims in Australian legal and policing systems. So, as said, from an intersectional feminist perspective, Me Too may be said to offer, as Sue puts it, a generative study for how exclusionary rhetorics emerge regardless of inclusive intentions. But then a perspective that emerges most pertinently from First Nations feminist scholarship and decolonial feminist approaches, which is that inclusion is not, in settler-colonial social and legal systems, is not like necessarily the goal. It's not the goal for all. So Unagut scholar Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang make this clear in their essay, Decolonisation is not a metaphor, about Indigenous rights and research in the Turtle Island context. They argue that the increasing use of the word decolonisation in metaphorical terms, really, and as commensurate with a range of human rights and social justice projects, is often counterproductive to the goals of land rights and sovereignty movements that they're trying to kind of centralise. They note this term can often constitute unhelpful settler-colonial moves towards innocence. And they write, decolonisation offers a different perspective to human and civil rights-based approaches to justice, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonisation is not an and, it is an elsewhere, they write. So they suggest within current settler-colonial social and legal landscapes, decolonisation projects are positioned currently as fugivity, as incommensurate and not necessarily reconcilable, not reconcilable with notions of land and labour as property. Decolonisation is not and cannot be projects of reconciliation for them, of negotiated treaties and sort of social inclusion of Indigenous people, as for them these all constitute moves towards imagining and rescuing a safe and still settled settler future. For them, projects of reconciliation are about rescuing settler normalcy, about rescuing a settler future. So then in her writing, in Maria Lugones' writing on the coloniality of gender, her concerns may appear to be more theoretical, but I think her provocations have no less practical outcomes. Lugones argues towards a decolonial feminism as a kind of refusal of the epistemologies, ontologies and logics of settler colonial capitalist modernity, including the logics of binary gender and feminist critiques of it, which are still kind of stuck within those logics. She describes the logic of modernity as a dichotomous, hierarchical and categorical kind of logic, and writes that modernity organises the world ontologically in terms of atomic, homogenous, separable categories. It is this logic that shapes dominant understandings of sex and gender, gendered subjects and identities, and understandings of sex-based social and cultural roles and the violence of normativity associated with them. Modernity, Lugones argues, denies the existence of other worlds with different ontological presuppositions. And for her, it is this denial that is coloniality. Lugones writes, contemporary women of colour and third world women's critique of feminist universalism centres the claim that the intersection of race, class, sexuality and gender exceeds the categories of modernity. If woman and black are terms for homogenous, atomic, separable categories, then their intersection, she writes, shows us the absence of black women rather than their presence. So for Lugones, to see non-white women is to exceed categorical logic. And her writing has helped me think more critically then about gender as an analytical object, and also about the kind of categorical approaches towards intersectionality that are coming from, you know, and that are increasingly common in some feminist cultures and feminist scholarship, and I would include my own there too. My colleague who I write a lot with, Akane Kanai, is currently undertaking a DECRA project on post-feminist digital media cultures and contemporary feminist blogospheres in Australia. And she's made some really important suggestions from her pilot study on this about the way that in which a discourse of intersectional inclusivity has become part of a white middle-class self-benchmarking exercise within what we've sort of understood and written about as the broader neoliberal sociocultural context. So Kanai interviewed young, mainly white, self-identifying feminists engaged with feminism primarily through digital cultures, and she finds in that data that in talking to those women, the incorporation of feminism into a disciplinary mechanism of self-perfection as part of what she describes as the effective and psychic life of neoliberalism. She's found there was a negotiation commonly going on between good feminism and bad feminism that's now happening for young women around the classification of prominent celebrities under the sign of the white feminist, the bad white feminist, and the intersectional feminist. And in very politically complex and ambiguous kind of to ambiguous ends. But Kanai writes, at a time when feminism is more popular and more kind of celebrified perhaps than ever before, she writes, I suggest it is necessary to inquire into the conditions of intersectionality seeming visibility and the practices through which it is taken up. So drawing on the work of queer feminist cultural theorists like Lauren Berlant and Sarah Ahmed, can I suggest that the practices she's encountered may paradoxically reinvigorate investments in middle-class whiteness in connecting goodness and the good life under the sign of acting as a kind of inclusive intersectional feminist. Following Lugones, I'd add, it becomes understandable then, following Lugones, that within the common logics of modernity as manifested in digital feminist cultures and spaces, an approach to intersectionality commonly emerges as the analysis of a range of distinct separate categories, distinct separate categorical and human-only subject positions, and the disciplinary powers that produce them, or the kind of sum total of combined power levelled at different subjects. Lugones summarises her move then, as I said, as a move to read the social from the cosmologies that inform it, which is quite different to one that reads gender into the social. I don't know if I'm making any sense. As such, First Nations and feminist scholars have suggested that while decolonisation is not and should not be a metaphor, it is bound up with what we call epistemological and ontological concerns. And the work of Quandamooka scholar Eileen Morton-Robinson has really helped illuminate this point for white Eurocentric feminists like me, coming from our Eurocentric thought traditions. Morton-Robinson writes, there is an inextricable link between a nation-state's sovereignty and what counts as knowledge, where and when it is produced and by whom. She explains what it would mean for her to work from an Australian Indigenous women's standpoint epistemologically as the basis for her research methods and practices. She suggests that this would allow for an ontology that centralises the interconnection of human beings with country, with plant and animal life forms, and also with ancestral beings and spirits who are part of that country. Morton Robinson describes the elements of her Indigenous epistemology that particularly inform her research as follows, writing, "I'm worth no more or less than other living things. The world I inhabit has been created by ancestral created beings and is organic and alive with spirits and signs which inform my way of knowing. And a methodology that acknowledges this view allows for ways of knowing and ways of doing research that can be guided by relationality with other forms of knowledge that exist beyond us as humans." Vanessa Watts is another key scholar there for me in articulating these ideas, particularly in her critique of the reconfining of spirit entities and animate beings to the realm of metaphor and symbol that she suggests happens in a lot of feminist STS and post-humanist scholarship in a move that restabilises Euro-centric ontologies. So Morton Robinson preempts some feminist criticism of her ideas on the basis of gendered and racial essentialism and responds to that as follows. She writes, "It could be argued that Indigenous women's standpoint theory is essentialist or is a form of strategic essentialism because I am imputing an essence to being Indigenous. However, from an Indigenous epistemology, what is essentialist is the premise upon which such a criticism is situated. That is the Western definition of the self as multiple, becoming and unfixed. This conception of the self, whose humanness is disconnected from the earth and values itself above every other living thing, is a form of strategic essentialism," Morton Robinson argues, "that can silence or dismiss non-Western constructions that do not define the self in the same way." So again here, there's some pretty important refusals that are needed. There's noted incommensurabilities with Western knowledge frameworks and ways of knowing, rather than a kind of a smooth inclusion and assimilation of Indigenous ways of knowing within settler-colonial states and Euro-centric logics of modernity. Morton Robinson's Australian Indigenous women's standpoint theory, and in the Turtle Island context, Vanessa Watts's writings about place thought, and Leanne Bader-Samasake-Simpson's grounded normativity and qua theories, for instance, each describe deeper levels of agency and consciousness in land, sky, water, objects, plants, animals, and spirit beings and entities than most Eurocentric scholarly traditions are willing to accept as valid and legitimate in scholarly contexts. And following following what Zoe Todd then argues that these perspectives, writing in the context of sort of critiques of feminist STS and STS more broadly, these perspectives cannot and should not be made to fit into the Eurocentric frame of epistemological ontological turns and concerns. Okay, so that's me working through that theory, and I'm going to leave that there for a moment and move on to kind of try and explain a bit further my own writing trajectory on gendered anger and my own kind of analytical investments in gender as a category before offering some analysis of the Tapsell and Lui creative intervention. So most recently, Akane Kanai and I have been together kind of analysing popular TV created and aimed towards young women and gender diverse folk as well. And in the first draft of this paper, I started out analysing the decentering of gender and humanness in the queer post-humanist children's cartoon, or that's how I describe it, Steven Universe. And then, and at the time I was writing it, this episode of Get Krack kind of came on and I was like, wow, okay, how can I, and I was trying to talk about both Steven Universe and Get Krack and the decentering of gender, but it's way too much to squish into one paper, so I'm not going to talk about Steven Universe. But we've been theorising, like, I guess, more recently, what we're calling effective divestment in patriarchal neoliberal modernity that we see as present in recent dramedy and comedy television written by and for women and gender diverse TV creators. And we see pertinent expressions of rage and social critique in the stories of writers such as Lena Durham, who wrote Girls, and Issa Rae, Insecure, and Broad City with Alana Glaser and Abby Jacobson. And in the Australian context, we can look to the work of, you know, Hannah Gadsby and Kate McClellan and Kate McCartney on the show I'm going to talk about, and Nakkiah Lui and Elaine Crosby on Kiki and Kitty, and several others. So I'd suggest that what we're trying to suggest is there's some important expressions of rage and critique coming through like popular TV and dramedies and comedies made by diverse women and gender diverse folk right now that would not have been perhaps as possible, as legible just a few years ago. And we think it's important to highlight expressions of rage, anger, and other kinds of affective dissonance following Claire Hemmings in various kinds of popular culture and creative forms in what Lauren Ballant calls the juxtapolitical space of kind of women's and queer culture, as well as in more directly political forms. As Indigenous literature scholar Daniel Heath Justice puts it, we can't possibly live otherwise until we first imagine otherwise. So there's lots of theorising about imagining otherwise as well that I won't go into now. So, you know, like I said, while I was writing up our paper on girls and young women's televised representations of anger in the post-recessional context, and at the same time trying to write a keynote on the decentering of gender in Steven Universe for a gender studies conference, like, I was pretty struck by the finale that aired at that time on Get Krack and the rage expressed in that episode. So Get Krack was created by Kate McClennan and Kate McCartney, who created the catering show on iView and then went on to create 2 seasons of this satirical morning television show, Get Krack, that aired in 2018 and 19 on the ABC. So I think a critical feminist lens is quite explicit in their writing. Both the catering show and Get Krack mount a critique of contemporary neoliberal norms of feminine subjectivity in terms of feeling rules, care obligations, and unfulfilled post-feminist promises made to women about their now supposedly unlimited achievement, their now complete inclusion within capitalist economies and heteropatriarchal working life in Australia. The second season appears to set out to address kind of social inclusion, social exclusion more explicitly, and I'd suggest perhaps influenced by the kinds of vernacular discourses of feminist intersectionality I've been gesturing to. The various segments within episodes in the second season centre around the disavowal on Australian television, or trying to show and highlight the disavowal on Australian TV and heteropatriarchal capitalist consumer and beauty cultures more broadly of other bodies, of people with disabilities, of Black, brown and Asian women, of lesbian and queer women and Australian Indigenous women. And in season 2 also, both hosts are pregnant and trying to hide the fact that they're pregnant on national television because they're scared of, they're trying to save their jobs, and as the season progresses they kind of become humorously very encumbered by their bodies, and both fearful and enraged at the possibilities of losing their TV host jobs. Quick theoretical note, Jose Esteban Munoz highlights the possibilities of performatively foregrounding failure within heteronormative colonial systems and mechanisms for judging such failure and success as an important goal in queer theory and cultural analysis. Munoz decries the inclusion of queers and queerness in what he sees as a corrupt and bankrupt social order. His cultural analysis and critique describes the aesthetics of queer failure and queer virtuosity in performances by queer artists as the performances of the failing status of queers within the dominant social order, as well as visualisations of a queerer future utopia. And in my analysis of Get Krack and in Steven Universe, I was kind of influenced by his writing as well as Jack Halberstam's on the generative possibilities of failure. So I thought I should mention that. So the last episode of season 2 was the finale of Get Krack, and it featured Nakkiah Tiwi writer and actress Miranda Tapsell and Gamila Roy Torres Strait Islander writer and comedian Nakkiah Lui. Lui has described the episode as what I put in the title, Miranda and Nakkiah decolonise morning television, and Lui wrote this episode with the Kates and also with Tapsell. So in the final episode, Kate McCartney starts to go into labour while she's hosting the show, and Kate McClellan kind of runs off and then comes back and informs the audience that they've just found out they're contractually obliged to continue filming until the baby crowns. So whilst the camera crews follow the Kates to the hospital, Tapsell and Lui, who were about to be interviewed by the Kates, are asked to take over as emergency studio hosts. They hold, Tapsell and Lui then, you know, have people seen this episode? Yeah. They hold cushions over their faces and pretend to have a private negotiation with each other over the pros and cons of hosting this overtly racist and sexist show. Tapsell argues the need to show Australian audiences that black women can be fun, cheerful and not angry. She convinces the reluctant Lui to do it for our people. Tapsell then warns Lui that if she wants to stay employed in TV as a black woman, she must smile, never complain, don't mention genocide, don't be angry and don't make a white lady cry. The two hosts then proceed throughout the episode to try to and then fail on all of these accounts. The reluctant Lui becomes better at suppressing her rage and playing the fun-loving co-host. Tapsell, however, grows increasingly uncomfortable with the complicity required of her through watching the transformation of her co-host into compliant, upbeat, feminine exuberance. It's Lui's too enthusiastic participation in a segment that is about the literal whitewashing of clothing that pushes Tapsell over the edge, and she snaps and delivers the following potent monologue, which I will try to show you, which goes for 5 minutes. I'm watching it again thinking, yeah, there's so much to be said about what's happening there on different levels. But I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to say something, which is that in this show, thinking back to Get Krack and as a whole, the frustration and rage of the Kates throughout the season comes from their position as thin white women, of still thinking they can succeed, of being invited to desire inclusion in heteropatriarchal settler-colonial models of commercial success and successful cis femininity, and yet failing constantly and inevitably as dictated by capitalist logics of gender. Lui and Tapsell, as Indigenous Australian women, were never really in the game in the first place, and this is highlighted in this episode by their position as kind of emergency guest hosts. Lui and Tapsell's is a rage fueled by a sense of predetermined failure and the failings of a model of femininity that was not constructed around their bodies. I'd suggest Lui's and Tapsell's is also a rage that cannot be as easily repaired, recuperated or commodified via the usual channels and logics of neoliberal post-feminist media and consumer cultures. The finale of Get Krack and its placement as such highlights the inevitable failure of both the white pregnant host and the Indigenous fill-in host to win visibility and acceptance within mainstream television frameworks of femininity and ratings success. The positioning of this episode as the finale for the entire show sends a strong message. If the rage of Indigenous Australian women is to be voiced and heard, the show can't go on in the same way. More episodes will constitute a kind of violent silencing, perhaps a recolonisation, even via the critical feminist satire framework of the show. As Kate McCartney put it in an interview, there is a reason why we want to stop our characters. Yeah, no, last episode of this show ever. Nakkiah and Miranda fucking nailed it to the wall. This episode went to air on Australian TV in a high point of visibility and attention in both the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. And it doesn't address those terms or those issues kind of directly, or the issue of gender violence directly. And this is precisely why, you know, for me, I think it might offer or function for me as a kind of intervention into the framing of violence and harassment that emerged out of Me Too, and the kind of individualised, racialised and Euro-centric carceral approaches towards gender violence that have prominently emerged since then from that movement. When contextualised as the finale of a feminist-leaning satirical show centred on offering a social critique primarily of gendered social structures and representations, and following Lugones as well as other decolonial feminist critiques of Me Too, the episode served to kind of highlight the dominant framing of sexual and gendered violence and racialised violence as two kind of distinct separate issues, and helped me better kind of think about the need to join the dots and understand both more deeply as forces and impacts of ongoing colonisation. I'd suggest then that what we, as in those concerned centrally with gender politics, feminism and violence, working and thinking in settler-colonial contexts, might think about in relation to this creative intervention is the placement here, or the displacement of gender as a clear and central object of critical attention. And gender sexism and heterosexism as axes of power and inequality still require ongoing critical attention, but I guess what I'm thinking is how do we remain mindful in the contemporary feminist landscape, and particularly in relation to the uptake and the spread of the kind of vernacular intersectionality that I've gestured to in digital media cultures, that we're not always simply trying to figure out how other bodies, other perspectives and other knowledge systems can be made to kind of fit into, can be assimilated into existing modern settler-colonial ways of knowing. Like Maria Lugones trying and failing to fit into her body colonising control underwear. There are important incommensurabilities that kind of need to stay foregrounded as such. And I think the second season of Get Krack and kind of foregrounds that same tension that Akane notes in contemporary feminist media and celebrity cultures around the take-up of a kind of vernacular understanding of intersectionality as inclusivity. In some, it's perhaps a more radical acknowledgement of failure, more radical notions of refusal, as well as deeper rejections of the categorical logics of modernity that can become hard to hold on to amidst prominent discourses of and approaches to intersectionality centred around a kind of inclusive feminist awareness. I'd suggest that this finale featuring Tapsell and Lui engages with such tensions and foregrounds, you know, failure, and then a more promising refusal here in line with the ideas of First Nations feminist and queer scholars on the radical and generative possibilities of such. Tapsell ultimately refuses the violently assimilationist logics that she and Lui have been upholding as guest hosts. She fails to suppress her rage and is mobilised by it. The pair literally make a mess, destroy the set, you know, attempt to shit on the stage and then move on to fuck up the set of Sunrise. Destruction here is the imagining otherwise that is offered. rather than a kind of demonstration of a way for Indigenous women to be included in mainstream television and in Australian settler colonial culture more broadly. So when I first presented these ideas in a keynote presentation for a critical femininity studies conference, like essentially a gender studies conference, I was trying to suggest how do we consider, as a room full of like scholars of gender and media culture, largely coming from, you know, Euro-centric frameworks, how our work and the work that we do in the future can and still does contribute to broader projects of imagining human and non-human lives otherwise, perhaps even or especially when the modernist and humanist frames of gender and femininity are kind of decentered as analytical axes. And I'm still kind of trying to consider this question or hold this question up. I don't have answers. But I'll end with, you know, the useful and clarifying kind of quote that I began with in thinking about what might be needed in the current political moment and in our thinking about the problem of gender violence that's kind of being constructed and highlighted for us at the moment, which is this one, you know, projects of inclusion don't necessarily rupture oppressive structures. Instead, they uphold and reinforce, showing how they can be kinder and gentler without actually changing much at all. I'm trying to keep that in mind. Thank you.